Do you believe in Bigfoot? I didn't either, until I heard a deathbed confession from a woman who lived alone in the remote woods of Tennessee. What she said gave me chills. She didn't just believe Bigfoot was real. She sat among an entire tribe of them, brewed herbal tea for their dying elder, and was saved by them during a flash flood because of one powerful belief: no one deserves to die alone. This story comes from Iris Keaton, 55 years old, widowed and heartbroken after losing her only daughter. She left society and lived off-grid for decades, recording herbs, tracking seasons, and forming a silent bond with something watching her from the woods. Stay with me for 60 seconds, and you'll learn the exact signs Bigfoot left near her cabin, why they chose her, of all people, to reveal themselves, and the final, wordless farewell that made her break down in tears. Back in 1989, Iris followed a giant figure into the forest, carrying nothing but a lantern and a pouch of herbs. What she found wasn't a monster. It was a plea for help. And if you think Bigfoot is just myth, this story might change everything. Because once you hear what happened that night, you'll realize some legends carry more humanity than we do. The wind-up on Cumberland was always different in late spring, like the land itself hadn't quite decided if it was ready to let go of winter. It carried the last breath of cold down from the plateau and across the Laurel Fork stream, whispering between the bare dogwood limbs and through the tin roofing of Iris Keaton's cabin. The wind there didn't howl. It murmured, old, tired, but still listening. That morning it brushed against the yellowing pages of Iris's worn Bible as it sat half-open beside her lantern, nudging the corner like a familiar friend waiting to be acknowledged. The lantern flickered low on the windowsill, casting a dull amber glow across the wooden floorboards. Outside, the first light was still gray, soft, hesitant. It spilled across the damp earth, catching on the dew that clung to the rows of potted mint, chamomile, and feverfew crowding the porch railing. Her knees ached as she leaned forward, pinching the dead tips from a stalk of echinacea, brushing her fingers over the petals like they were someone's hair. She hadn't slept much. Sleep didn't come easy when you lived with ghosts. Inside the cabin, a kettle whistled. She stood slowly, joints cracking, and walked with the kind of quiet purpose that came from decades of knowing where everything was. The floor didn't creak under her feet anymore. It had learned her weight. As the steam rose from the enamel pot, she poured the hot water over willow bark shavings, then set the cup aside to steep. She didn't need it today. Not for herself, but rituals had to be kept, even when there was no one left to keep them with. The photograph on the wall near the stove had faded to sepia. Her husband in his coal dust coveralls, grinning in front of the mine entrance, hand wrapped around her waist. He'd been crushed under a roof collapse in '77, same year they learned their daughter's heart couldn't handle another winter. That was when the house had started going quiet. Not the kind of quiet you pray for. The kind that settles into your bones like wet leaves. She wore his flannel shirt now. Sleeves rolled past her elbows, and her daughter's rosary beads hung from the neck of the oil lamp. Iris didn't talk about those things, not because she was hiding them, but because grief that deep stops needing words. You just carry it, like you carry a basket of stones through a stream. Careful, slow, no sudden movements. Mid-morning, she packed a biscuit and a folded rag into her canvas pouch. The cloth was plain, undyed cotton with faint green stitching. She'd had it since her hospice days, used to wrap cooling herbs for patients whose bodies were fighting harder than their spirits. She still remembered the weight of their hands when they asked her not to leave. No one should go alone, she muttered now, slipping the biscuit inside and tying the cloth with practiced fingers. She walked barefoot down the trail behind her house, over moss-slick stones and through a thicket of fern that parted like water. The woods knew her steps. Nothing startled. Not the rabbit near the cedar roots, nor the pair of chickadees flitting from branch to branch above her. She moved like part of the land, worn, quiet, expected. At the base of an old sycamore, she crouched down and laid the biscuit on the gnarled root that curled like a cupped hand. Same place she always left it. She told herself it was for the squirrels, the possums, even the raccoons. But some part of her, some part she never wrote down, hoped something else took it. Something that understood the silence in her heart. Back at the house, the afternoon came slow. A spring drizzle passed through. Not enough to soak, just enough to change the smell of everything. Iris sat on the porch, sharpening her garden shears with a flat stone, humming a hymn she hadn't sung out loud in years. Farther along we'll know all about it, she whispered to herself, the blade scraping rhythmically. Farther along we'll understand why. As the sun slipped behind the ridge, shadows crept across the yard like spilled ink. The lantern came back on. The fire inside was low, just enough to cast shapes on the wall. She opened her journal, not the kind with dreams and thoughts, but the one filled with plant names and dosages, each one written in her daughter's script. She traced a finger down to the page on mullein. Good for the lungs. She paused, then looked toward the tree line. Something out there, she thought, or maybe it was nothing. But the air felt different. She closed the journal, stood, and walked to the edge of the porch. The forest beyond the clearing was a wall of shadow. Beyond it, Laurel Fork murmured to itself, and the leaves trembled in a breeze that no longer reached her skin. The sky had turned to iron, the kind of color that came before a storm or after a revelation. And then she heard it. It wasn't a growl, not a scream, not even a grunt. Just breath. Long, heavy, drawn like someone waking from sleep. It came from the trees, not far beyond where the biscuit had been left. Her hand froze on the porch railing. The sound wasn't loud, but it was deep. Deeper than anything she'd heard from a man or animal. It wasn't hungry. It wasn't angry. It sounded tired. She stayed there, still as stone. Her breath matched it for a moment, then faltered. She didn't call out, didn't light another lamp, just stood there in the dark while the thing, whatever it was, breathed. Then silence. Not the peaceful kind, the charged kind. Every cricket held its voice. Even the breeze stilled, as if the whole forest was waiting to see what she'd do next. She didn't run. She didn't retreat. She whispered something without realizing. An old prayer, maybe, or her husband's name. Her hand reached up to her collar, fingers brushing the edge of the cross she still wore. Then she turned back inside, closed the door softly, and left the porch light burning. That night she dreamed of eyes. Not glowing, not red, just watching. Round and wide, like a child's, but set in something enormous. There was no fear in the dream, just that sound again, that long, patient breath, and the feeling that someone had been standing outside her house for a long time before she ever noticed. When she woke, the air inside felt colder than it should have. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, walked to the porch with the lantern still lit, and looked out across the clearing. Nothing moved, but the biscuit was gone, and near the base of the tree, the cloth she had wrapped it in had been folded, not crumpled, not tossed, but neatly folded, and placed on the same root where she'd left the food. She stared at it a long while, then walked over slowly, picked it up, turned it in her hand. No mud, no teeth marks, just dry cotton, warm from something that had held it recently. She held it to her face without knowing why. It smelled of cedar and something faintly sweet, like crushed flowers or old leather, and just below the tree, half hidden in the moss, 2 pieces of dry grass had been laid side by side, not random, parallel, deliberate. She didn't touch them. She looked up into the trees, toward the ridge, and whispered, "I see you." No answer came. Only the wind again, returning from wherever it had gone. She folded the cloth once more, tucked it into her pocket, and walked back toward the house without looking back. Behind her, the woods stayed silent, watching, waiting. The first week of June came in with a breathless hush and left behind a forest thick with steam. Rain arrived without warning now, sudden and hard, then gone just as fast, leaving the soil swollen and the trees dripping like they'd been crying in secret. The laurel fork swelled against its own banks, not angry, just full of memory. The kind that seeped into stone and moss and the skin behind your ears. Iris felt it even before her boots touched the path, like the land was starting to remember something it hadn't said out loud in a long time. She stood on the edge of her porch one morning, wiping her hands on a faded kitchen towel, her eyes tracing the thin silver thread of steam rising from the earth. The kind of heat that makes everything smell alive. Loamy, damp, like breath on your neck. Behind her, the old radio crackled faintly but caught no signal. Nothing but static and the occasional hiccup of a gospel choir long since faded. She didn't turn it off. Silence can sometimes make you feel lonelier than noise. That day, she packed 2 apples in her pouch, both slightly bruised but still good. She wrapped them in fresh cloth, another piece from her hospice drawer, and tied it tight, just like she used to for the patients who couldn't chew. The cloth mattered. It said, "I meant this." She didn't say who the apples were for. She didn't need to. The roots of that sycamore tree had started to feel like a church pew. You didn't talk much when you were there. You just laid things down and waited. She moved slow on the slope that led to the creek, her knees stiff from the change in weather. Every now and then she paused, not out of pain, but because she felt something. A shift, like the woods had stopped pretending not to see her. Down by the water, the mud was thick and soft, swallowed the toe of her boot like it had been waiting. She caught herself before slipping and leaned on the branch of a young poplar, steadying her breath. Then she saw it. A track. It wasn't the first time she'd seen odd shapes near the stream. Sometimes a sunken heel that looked too wide. Other times, half a print at the edge of a pool, almost melted by the flow. But this one was different. Clear. Deep. Unmistakable. She crouched, heart fluttering the way it had when she used to sneak into her daughter's room late at night just to watch her breathe. The print stretched nearly twice the length of her foot, the arch unmistakably lifted. The toes splayed with pressure, like the owner had been heavy, maybe even thoughtful in their step. The middle toe had a slight curve inward, a detail too strange to be someone playing a trick. She stayed there a while, one hand resting on her thigh, the other hovering just above the print. Not touching, just feeling the air around it. It was fresh. No water pooled in it yet. The edges still held shape. Whatever made it had passed through not long before her. Iris stood slowly, her breath catching in her throat, and looked up toward the trees on the opposite bank. Nothing moved, but the woods felt full, like a room where someone had just left, or someone hadn't left yet. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached into her pouch and pulled out the bundle. She unwrapped one apple and placed it gently on a flat stone by the base of a moss-covered root. The cloth she folded in half and set beside it, weighted with a small rock. Then she backed away slowly, not turning her back until the tree line swallowed the gift. That night, thunder rolled far off in the distance, not close enough to be frightening, just near enough to remind you it could find you if it wanted. Rain came again in waves, tapping the tin roof like fingers playing a rhythm only the dark understood. She slept restlessly, a thin film of sweat on her brow despite the open windows. Her dreams flickered. Moss, fur, a low sound like breath filtered through leaves. She didn't wake with a start. She woke like someone being gently shaken. By morning, the rain had passed, but the world outside still held its scent. She stepped onto the porch barefoot, wrapped in her shawl, and breathed in the wet air. Then she followed the path again, this time with no apples, no bundle. Just the memory of the footprint and the weight in her chest, that something was happening whether she welcomed it or not. At the base of the sycamore, the stone was bare. The apple was gone. But the cloth hadn't been left to rot or blown into the brush. It had been folded. Precisely. Corners aligned. Tucked into the notch between two roots, as if someone had not only understood what it was, but wanted her to know they'd understood. She knelt down and picked it up slowly. There were no smudges, no paw prints, no bite marks. It had been held by fingers, or something close to them. As she stood, she noticed something new. 2 stalks of dry grass laid side by side on the dirt just beside the roots. Not crossed, not jumbled, parallel, straight, almost ceremonial in their placement. She stared at them, a strange tightening in her chest. She didn't move them, didn't take them, just stepped back slowly, one hand over her mouth, the other holding the folded cloth. That evening she sat in her chair by the window long after the sun went down. The lantern stayed unlit. She didn't need light. She needed memory. She played the moment over and over in her mind, the way she used to replay her husband's last phone call or the time her daughter reached out mid-fever and whispered, "Don't go yet." Iris had seen death, held it, sung to it. She knew when something was ending. But this felt like a beginning. A question posed in silence, a language with no words but perfect clarity. Later that week, during another burst of afternoon rain, she saw them. Eyes not imagined? Not the way a deer's might flash for a second and vanish. These stayed, still, set into the tree line at the edge of the clearing. They didn't move when she moved, didn't blink, just stared. She was carrying a bundle of firewood when she noticed them. Her breath caught mid-step. The logs slipped from her arms, thudding softly onto the wet earth. She didn't bend to retrieve them. She didn't dare. The eyes were high, taller than any man she'd known, even with boots. But they weren't glowing like in stories. No. They caught the light, refracted it maybe. But they weren't unnatural, just alert, present. Like someone thinking. She whispered something, not even sure what. Maybe her husband's name. Maybe her own. Maybe just the word, please. And then the eyes were gone. No rustle, no break in the trees. Just there 1 second, gone the next. Like someone had closed a curtain, she walked back to the porch, trembling. Not from fear exactly, but from something deeper. Reverence. The way you feel walking into a sanctuary after too many years away. That night, she wrote a single sentence in her daughter's notebook, the one where she kept her herbal formulas. No date, no flourish. They see me. She closed the book and sat in the dark until her tea turned cold. The next morning, when she walked the trail again, the 2 stalks of dry grass were still there. But this time, a third had been added. Slightly shorter. Curved at one end like it had once bent in wind. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it meant something, and she whispered just to the trees, "I'm listening." From deep in the woods, far enough that it could have been imagination, but close enough that it felt real, came the sound of movement. Not crashing, not panic, just a shift. A step, like someone turning to leave because they knew they'd been heard. The breeze picked up then, curling through her shawl, rustling the leaves, and carrying with it the faintest scent of wet pine and something else beneath it. Something that reminded her of old wool and damp earth, and the warmth of skin held close in grief. She didn't cry, not yet. The heat didn't leave when the sun went down. It just settled lower, wrapped tighter around everything like a damp wool blanket no one asked for. The kind of heat that crept under your shirt and stayed there, whispering. The kind that made the floorboards sticky to bare feet and turned the screen door into a slow swinging metronome, counting down something you couldn't name. June bled into July, and the nights got louder. Crickets screaming like they had something to prove, frogs croaking until their throats gave out. But that night, the noise stopped. No wind, no wings, no rhythm. Just stillness thick as honey and heavy in the lungs. Iris felt it before she noticed it. The kind of quiet that slides in sideways. You don't see it, but you know it's there. It was past midnight when she sat up in bed, unsure why. The air was slick and the back of her neck damp. The lantern on the windowsill gave off a faint flicker, just enough to cast soft gold against the wall. She listened. Nothing. No owls, no cicadas, no drip from the gutter. Just her own breath, small and uneven. She didn't get up right away. She stared at the wooden ceiling. The same knot in the pine that looked like a weeping eye stared back at her. Something in her chest pulled forward. Not fear. Something deeper. Old instinct. Like how her fingers used to twitch awake when a patient's breathing shifted on the hospice monitor. Something's coming, the body says before the brain agrees. She reached for her robe, tugged it over her shoulders, and stepped quietly out to the porch. The humidity clung to her skin like a second layer. The stars were muffled behind a film of haze, and the tree line looked swollen in the dark, closer than it had any right to be. She stood there a moment, letting her eyes adjust when she heard it. Not a voice, not a growl. Just the rustle of brush, deliberate, controlled. Too big to be deer, too light to be a bear. Then silence again. She stepped down into the yard barefoot, the grass damp and warm between her toes. The kerosene lantern swung in her hand, casting a wavering circle ahead of her. She didn't speak, didn't call out. The air felt breakable, halfway to the trail. She paused. Her breath caught, and she held the lantern out, arm trembling. At the far end of the clearing, just beyond where the fern thicket met the rise, something moved. Slow. Massive. It stepped forward on all fours, not crawling, not hunched, but like someone testing the strength of the ground. Then it rose, not fully upright at first. Its head lowered, one arm still brushing the earth. It stood in that strange posture animals take when they're not sure if you're a threat or a prayer. Then, slowly, it placed its open palm to the ground. Iris didn't move. Her legs locked, not in fear, but in awe. The creature, whatever it was, held her gaze. Its eyes were wide, dark, and shining like two stones held to the fire. There was no snarl, no menace, just watching. Waiting. Then it did something she didn't expect. It raised its hand to its chest. Large, flat, and silent. It pressed its palm gently over its heart. Then stepped back. Iris felt her throat tighten. The heat, the silence, the night, all of it swirled inside her ribs like a slow storm. She didn't think. She just followed. Her boots had been left by the door, so she went barefoot down the trail, the lantern swinging lower now. The woods accepted her like they had before, but different. The air was thicker, charged. The path ahead lit only in slices. The creature moved ahead of her, never too far, always just visible enough to keep her following. It didn't crash through the underbrush. It glided, as if it knew the layout of every root, every rock, every space where the ground dipped just enough to twist an ankle. Iris matched its pace, not running, not hesitating. Her breath was shallow. Her heart beat loud in her ears, drowning out every other sound. She kept one hand tight around the lantern, the other curled around the small pouch at her waist. Habit more than need. The cloth inside was still damp with crushed leaves and pine resin. She didn't know why she brought it, but her hands always seemed to find it when the world stopped making sense. As they reached a bend in the creek where the bank dropped off sharply, the creature paused. Its shoulders heaved once, not with exhaustion, but with something close to relief. Then it turned. Iris stopped too. The lantern's light brushed against its face. Not fully, just enough to catch a glimpse. The fur was dark and matted with summer sweat. The skin beneath, not rough like leather, but smoother, like old bark worn down by rain. Its eyes caught the light again. They weren't human, but they weren't wild either. They were something else, something that remembered. It pointed, Not with a finger, but with the turn of its shoulders, the lean of its frame. A suggestion. This way. Iris nodded, though she knew it wouldn't understand. Or maybe it would. They moved deeper into the woods, the kind of deep where you don't hear your own footsteps anymore, only the whisper of branches parting and closing behind you. The trees thickened, the canopies swallowing what little moonlight remained. The air changed. Cooler now. Pine gave way to damp stone, moss soft underfoot. She felt the pull of something ancient, not haunted, not evil, just old, tired, sacred. She began to notice signs, small ones, cleft stones arranged in arcs, branches tied with vines, hanging low like pendulums. The forest wasn't random anymore. It was arranged. Someone had shaped this space. The creature slowed, then stopped. Iris did too. Ahead, the trail vanished into a curtain of fern and low-hanging vine. No sound, no breeze. Just the kind of stillness that happens in churches when the preacher stops talking and everyone waits to see if the spirit speaks instead. The creature turned to her. It didn't touch her, just looked. One hand reached out, palm open, not asking, offering. She stepped closer, her breath catching. Then, from somewhere deep beyond that green curtain, something moved. Not like before, not soft. This was sharper, a shift, a presence. She heard something like breath, but it wasn't steady. It was ragged, shallow, strained. A rhythm she knew too well, the sound of someone dying. The creature didn't look toward the sound. It kept its eyes on her, hand still extended. And in that moment, Iris understood. This wasn't just curiosity or trust. This was a plea. She reached out and placed her hand briefly on its palm, then stepped past it, into the fern, the vines parting like curtains. The path beyond was narrower, the air colder. She raised the lantern, but the oil was running low now. The flame flickered, stretched thin. Ahead, nestled between two boulders and wrapped in a nest of moss and cedar bark, was a body, large, motionless, covered in silvered fur streaked with patches of dark. The chest rose and fell in shallow pulls. The breath whistled, wet, uneven. The smell was strong, earth, sweat, sap, and something else beneath it. Illness. Iris didn't speak. She didn't call out. Her body moved before her mind could reason. She stepped closer. The creature behind her remained at the entrance, watching. The one on the ground, the elder, she thought, didn't open its eyes. Its limbs were too still, the rise of its chest too faint. But it was alive. Barely. She knelt, the moss cool beneath her knees. Her fingers brushed gently along its shoulder, then moved toward the chest. The skin felt warm, too warm. Fever. She could smell it now. Infection. Breathing shallow, likely fluid in the lungs. Pulse. She pressed against the wrist. Slow, thready. But there. She sat back on her heels, and for the first time in over a decade, she spoke the words she used to whisper bedside at work. You don't have to be alone. No one answered. But the night seemed to pause, as if listening. She stood slowly, turned back toward the younger one still watching, and nodded once. I understand. Then she sat beside the elder again, pulling the pouch from her belt. The silence held, not empty but full, and the forest, for just a moment, seemed to exhale. The wind carried the scent of turning leaves, not sharp yet, but softened by damp moss and the hush of a forest settling into itself. It was early October in Cumberland, and the woods had begun their quiet dying, one leaf at a time. The ridges blushed red and copper, but down in the hollows where the sun barely touched, the air stayed cool and still, caught between seasons like a breath held too long. Iris knew that kind of pause. She wore it in her chest. She walked slower now, not from weakness but from listening. The path she followed wasn't carved with boots or tools. It was suggested, shaped over time by things that passed softly and often. Things that left no marks a ranger would note, but that a healer might feel underfoot. The trail curved and dipped, ducked beneath hanging vines, and bent through rock and root like it didn't want to be found. She carried her lantern low, the flame steady even as dusk settled into the understory. A worn satchel tugged against her hip, filled with wrapped herbs and dried mullein, salves she'd stirred with the end of a cedar twig the night before, and a folded cloth that once wrapped her daughter's doll when the girl was too small to speak. The forest had grown quieter since the last time. Not empty, never that, but watchful, as if the trees had heard something they weren't ready to repeat. Iris didn't speak either. Words felt too heavy now, like they'd echo wrong. She just kept walking, deeper, past where the creek widened and the trees leaned together like old women whispering, past a hollow where once she thought she'd seen a set of stone shapes not quite natural, not quite random, now buried beneath fallen leaves. She felt it before she saw it. A bend in the trail she hadn't noticed before. A shift in temperature, colder by a margin too slim to measure but too clear to ignore. The vines ahead thickened, draped low like a curtain. She reached up, fingers brushing aside threads of green that clung like wet hair, and stepped through. What waited on the other side wasn't open. It was close, tight. The trees pulled back, but the stone came forward. The ground sloped down and then disappeared into rock. A wall that looked solid from afar, but as she stepped closer, revealed itself to be broken, fractured, split like lips that hadn't spoken in years. There was an opening, almost hidden behind a spill of ferns and moss. The mouth of the cave was low and wide, not jagged but smooth, worn by time and water and things that had moved in and out of it long before her kind drew maps. Ivy clung to the edges. Damp earth breathed out from its mouth, cool and sharp with the scent of stone and something faintly sweet, like lichen crushed underfoot. She lifted the lantern and stepped closer. Inside, the darkness wasn't total. The light from her flame caught on moisture clinging to the walls, turned it into little glimmers that blinked like distant eyes. She could make out the shape of the passage, narrow but not tight, curving inward. A thin trickle of water lined one edge, tracing a path that had taken centuries to decide where to go. She hesitated at the edge, not from fear, from reverence. Then she ducked and stepped in. The space opened slowly as she moved forward. The walls widened. The ceiling arched high above her head. The smell of damp fur and old bark grew stronger, and then her light hit something that made her stop. Eyes, more than one set, some low, some high, none glowing, just reflecting, watching. She didn't move, didn't raise the lantern further, just stood, breathing shallow. The figures stayed still, silent, shadowed shapes within the stone, broad shoulders, long arms, some small, some towering, but none stepped forward. Iris's heart pounded, not with panic, but with awe. Then she saw him, lying in the center of the space, not on stone, but on a bed of moss and woven leaves. His fur silvered and dull. One hand curled inward, the other resting palm down beside him. His breath came in stuttered bursts, chest rising and falling like a tide out of rhythm. Around him, the others stood, some kneeling, some hunched, all watching. And in the silence, she felt it again. That same feeling from the night before. The pull, the plea. She stepped forward slowly, her boots scuffing softly on the stone. No one moved to stop her. Her lantern cast wide now, touched the walls, flicked over forms that turned but didn't flinch. She knelt beside him, the leader, the elder, the one they had brought her for. His breath hitched as she settled by his side. She reached into her satchel, pulled free a folded cloth, unwrapped a bundle of dried herbs, pinched a small amount between her fingers, and crushed it gently beneath his nose. He twitched, not startled, but aware. Eyes didn't open, but something in his body softened, like a door no longer held shut. Then a sound, a shuffling from behind. She turned. The young one had stepped forward. The same one who had led her through the dark, the one with the eyes that mirrored grief. He knelt beside her, silent, head lowered. And then, with great care, he placed his palm on the ground beside her own, then raised it, then pressed it to his own chest. A gesture, an offering, a ritual. Her hand trembled as she mirrored the motion, unsure if it was right, but feeling that it was needed. Ground, heart, silence. Then he turned that hand outward, flat, toward the elder, pressed it gently to the place just below the elder's ribs, then stepped back. She understood. He was asking her to try. The space was tight, the air thick, but her hands moved as they always had. Confident, steady. She placed warm cloths against the elder's chest, massaged the muscles between his shoulders, whispered nothing, just breathed with him, matched her rhythm to his until, slowly, the shudder of his breath eased. Just a little, but enough. Time passed in no clear measure. The flame in her lantern dimmed, but she stayed. She didn't ask for help, didn't need it. She felt the eyes watching, not in judgment, in faith. She reached for her pouch again, fingers brushing against something she hadn't packed. A cedar leaf, dried, curled. She held it in her palm, looked up. The young one met her gaze. Had he placed it there, or had it found its way in? She didn't know. She placed it beside the elder's hand, then sat back. Her body ached, her eyes burned. But she felt something then, a breath, not hers, not ragged, stronger, steady. She didn't smile, didn't cry, just closed her eyes, one hand resting lightly on her lap, the other near his. She stayed like that, surrounded by stone, fur, silence, and eyes that understood things the world above had long forgotten. She didn't know what time it was when she finally stood, but when she did, no one stopped her. The young one stepped aside. The others remained where they were, watching, still. But she felt it as she turned toward the exit. She wasn't walking away from strangers. Not anymore. She stepped into the cool night, her lantern nearly out, her knees stiff. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. Behind her, the breath of the cave whispered once more. Not in pain this time, in thanks. And far above the trees, the wind moved again. Just once. Just enough to carry her name. By the end of October, the forest had turned brittle and bronze. The maples around the ridge clung to their last leaves like memories not ready to let go. Every gust scattered more across the mossy floor, layering the path to the cave in crisp patches of red and ochre that crunched faintly beneath Iris's boots. The rain had changed, too. Not the summer's sudden sheets, but a slow, steady drizzle that soaked through sleeves and made the cold settle in deep, like a sigh behind the bones. It came most days now, never with warning, never enough to flood, just enough to remind you winter was close. The sky stayed low and the light stayed gray. Even the birds had gone quiet. The woods were preparing for something. So was she. Iris moved through the trees like she had every morning for the past 5 days, her hands tucked into fingerless gloves, a dry bundle of mullein and willow bark tied to her satchel with twine. The satchel itself had grown heavier, not with weight, but with the way its contents now carried more meaning than medicine. She checked them every night by the light of her lantern, crushed a leaf between her palms, sniffed, nodded, like checking a heartbeat with her nose instead of a stethoscope. She didn't keep track of time anymore, only changes. The elder's breathing had slowed 2 days ago. Not worse, just steadier. The rasp was still there, but softer. Less fight, more rest. She reached the cave mouth just after noon, ducked beneath the draping ivy, and felt that familiar cold bloom against her cheeks. Inside, the light from the lantern flickered across the smooth stone like fire dancing in a throat. The air smelled of damp cedar and something almost metallic, like blood that had dried and softened into memory. She didn't pause, Her feet knew where to go now. Her hands did too. The others were there when she arrived. As always, silent, watching. She never counted them. But they moved differently now. More relaxed. Not trusting, but accepting. They'd shifted positions in the cave, built more bedding from dry moss and pine boughs. One of the smaller ones had dragged in a branch with berries still clinging to it, left it near the elder's resting place. Another one had layered fern over a leak in the ceiling, patched with mud. She noticed everything. She said nothing. That was their way. And now, hers too. The elder lay as before, on his side, curled slightly, one arm outstretched, the other tucked. His chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, wet still, but rhythmic. Iris crouched beside him and felt his forehead with the back of her hand. Warm, still too warm, but not burning. She opened her satchel, pulled out a cloth she'd warmed with a hot stone back at the cabin, and gently placed it beneath his shoulder. His breath hitched, not in pain, in response. He knew she was there. She mixed the crushed willow bark into a small leather pouch lined with wax paper, poured in a touch of warm water from her thermos, and let it steep. The steam curled up into the cold air, carrying a bittersweet smell that reminded her of old barns and cut roots. She leaned close, placed her hand over his and squeezed, slow and firm, then brought the pouch to his lips. He didn't drink at first, but then his mouth parted slightly, and she guided the rim gently until a small sip disappeared between his teeth. She waited. Another, then another. Just enough. She wiped the edges of his mouth with a strip of gauze. As she did, she noticed one of the smallest creatures, barely half her size, watching from a crouch nearby. It had mimicked her motion, tracing a finger along a rock and then wiping it with a curled leaf. Iris stared, something catching in her throat. The tiny one noticed, dropped the leaf, looked down, embarrassed maybe, or shy. She smiled and slowly nodded. Not to praise, just to say, "Yes, I see you." Then she turned back to the elder and tucked a new cloth beneath his neck. He exhaled, long and shaky, a sound like someone finally resting. She wiped his forehead again, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a soft piece of wool, rubbed between her palms to warm it. As she worked, her mind drifted. Not away, but back. There'd been a night, years ago, in a hospice room with a little clock on the wall ticking far too loud, when her daughter had stopped breathing for a moment and her hand had gone cold. Iris had gripped it tight, pressing her own warmth into those fingers, whispering something useless but necessary. A nurse had asked if she wanted someone to sit with her. Iris hadn't answered. The nurse never asked again. That memory returned now, not like a wound, but like a quiet tide. She reached out and took the elder's hand again, the fingers long, coarse with age, knotted but not weak. She held it, gently rocked it. Her voice stayed low, a vibration more than words. No one should go alone. The cave held the silence that followed like a bowl cupped to catch breath. She sat back, her hands still damp, her knees aching. The younger one, the first who had brought her here, stepped forward and crouched beside her. Its eyes met hers for the first time in days, and in them she saw exhaustion. Not just fear, not confusion, fatigue, worry, love. It didn't speak, but it reached out and mimicked her again, this time touching the elder's chest, then wiping the brow. Its movements were slower, careful. She watched it. Then she reached into her satchel again and pulled out her little tin kettle. The fire pit was old now, built up stone by stone in one corner of the cave. She'd started it weeks ago, first with hesitation, now with ease. She set the kettle over the flame, balanced it with care, then added more water from her canteen and tucked in a bundle of dried mullein. The young one knelt beside her, watching every motion. When the steam began to rise, it looked to her, waiting. She smiled without showing teeth, poured some into a shallow bowl, and set it down near the elder's head. The steam curled up, slow and steady. She waved her hand gently to direct it toward his face. The young one copied her again. Later, when she opened her thermos and sipped the last of her coffee, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. Another small one, not the same, had picked up a strip of cloth from her open satchel. Not roughly, not like a child stealing. Just curious. It held it between its fingers, sniffed, turned it over, then placed it back exactly where it had found it. With care, with understanding, she felt something shift inside her. Not surprise, not pride. Something quieter. A thread pulling tight between them all. The elder stirred again. His eyes didn't open, but his breath drew deeper for a moment, then steadied. The younger one pressed its hand to his shoulder. She watched the two of them and felt tears well but not fall. When she finally stood to leave, her knees popped, her back throbbed. She gathered her things slowly, careful not to disturb the calm that had settled like a blanket over the stone. She turned back before exiting. They were all still there, still watching, still silent, still present. And she saw them, truly saw them, not as creatures or legends, but as something closer to family. Something sacred, she whispered again, not expecting an answer. "I'll be back tomorrow." As she stepped outside, the rain had paused. The mist still clung to the trees, the smell of wet bark and smoke still fresh. She tugged her coat tighter, started back down the trail. Behind her, the cave stayed dark, but for the first time in days, she didn't feel afraid to leave it. Because she knew they would stay with him, and he would not be alone. She never looked back when she crossed the ridge, but she didn't need to. Because somewhere, in the hush of those trees, she knew a hand just like hers had wrapped a warm cloth and laid it down with care. The wind had changed again. By the first week of November, it howled not just from the ridges but down in the hollers too, threading through the bare limbs like it was searching for something. The rain came without pause now, thin, mean, and cold, eating at the hillsides, swelling the laurel fork past its calm self, turning trails into ribbons of mud and stone. You could feel the ground give if you stepped wrong. The kind of season that got into your bones and reminded you how fragile everything was, even the earth. Iris had felt the pressure shift in her ears before the storm even hit. That morning the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the crows were gone. She didn't bother with her usual trail tea. She just wrapped her coat tight, filled her satchel, and left without locking the door. Something in her ribs told her there wouldn't be time. By the time she reached the tree line, the wind had already started to push back. The deeper she walked, the less the trees sheltered her. The leaves were mostly gone now, leaving bare branches to clack and sway, like bones rattling in an attic. She moved faster than usual, boots sucking into the soft ground with every step, one hand gripping a hickory stick she'd leaned against her porch for years, but hadn't touched since her husband passed. It steadied her now. By the time she reached the cave, her scarf was soaked through and her fingers had stiffened. The ivy curtain flapped in wild rhythm, and water trickled down the stones like sweat on a fevered brow. She ducked inside, breath shallow, heart thudding louder than the rain. The moment she stepped in, the cold hit her differently, wetter, deeper. Something was wrong. She called out, not with words, but with her presence. Her boots scraped the cave floor. Her breath fogged in the lantern light. The smaller ones appeared first, their eyes wide, shoulders tense. They didn't move toward her. They just watched. Then came the younger one, the one who'd brought her the first night, now drenched and panting, fur slick against its frame. It didn't gesture. It just turned and vanished into the deeper end of the cave. She followed. They led her not to the bedding place, but to the far wall, past where she thought the cave had ended. A crack had opened, recent by the look of it. fresh rock dust, scattered stones, and a new smell of wet clay and rot. She stepped over the rubble and found herself in a narrow offshoot of the chamber. And that's when she heard it. The rush, not wind, water, fast, hungry. A sound no cave should carry unless something upstream had broken loose. She pushed forward and found them. 5 or 6 shapes clustered around the elder, who had been moved up onto a rise of stone, but not high enough. Water was pushing in from a fissure near the floor, rising fast, licking at the edges of the bedding. Moss floated. A basket of dried leaves had already spilled and vanished. The elder's breath was ragged again. Iris dropped to her knees, ignoring the cold that soaked through. She pressed her hand to his chest. Shallow, weak, but there. She looked up at the others, then at the water. It was rising faster now, inches gone in seconds. She stood, heart pounding, and moved to the younger one. Gripped its arm. It flinched but didn't pull away. She pointed to the bedding, then to the far ledge, the one near the bend where the air seemed clearer. It hesitated, eyes flicking toward the water. She didn't wait. She stepped into the rising flow and began hauling stones with both hands, stacking them one by one to build a barrier between the breach and the elder's resting place. Her fingers burned. Her boots slipped. But she kept moving. Then movement. The younger one joined her. Then another. Then 2 more. No words. No gestures. Just bodies pressed into work. Muscles straining. Hands heaving wet rocks. Limbs trembling with effort. They built together a wall of stone and mud. Barely holding, but buying time. That's all she needed. Time. She ran back to the satchel, yanked it open with shaking hands, pulled out the small tin of willow bark, and tossed it to the edge. Then she grabbed her thermos, uncapped it with her teeth, and poured the last of the warm water into a gourd bowl that someone, she didn't know who, had carved and left near the fire ring. The fire had gone out. Smoke still clung to the roof of the cave like memory. She dipped cloth into the tea, squeezed it once, and pressed it to the elder's lips. A shudder, then a swallow. Not much, but enough. That's when the cave floor bucked beneath her. A tremor. Just one. But it knocked the stones loose. Water surged in through the crack. The wall they'd built gave an inch, then another. She screamed, sharp, low, a sound that tore through the silence like a tree cracking in the wind. They responded before she did. 2 of the larger ones grabbed the elder's bedding, lifted it with trembling arms, and began hauling it toward the higher ground. The younger one threw its shoulder into a slab of stone, blocking half the breach. Water splashed over him, but he didn't move. Iris ran to help, her knees giving on the slick floor, arms wrapping around the bedding from the other side. Together they lifted, dragged, pulled him clear. The wall collapsed. Water flooded in. One of the smaller creatures screamed, a high, keening cry of fear, and darted toward a corner. Another followed. The light from the lantern flickered, then died. Darkness. Iris's heart surged in her chest. She couldn't see, couldn't feel the elder's breath, couldn't tell if the others were still upright. Then heat, a burst, orange light from the far side of the chamber. They'd started a fire. Not large, not clean, but real. They had dropped stones into a hollowed-out bark basin and heated them, just like she had taught them. Steam rose from the bowl. The younger one dragged her toward it, then pressed her hands near the edge. She felt the warmth. Then hands, large hands, wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her close. She collapsed then, not from pain, from release. They surrounded her, pressed close. She felt fur against her back, arms across her legs, shoulders against her ribs. Someone, something, wrapped her scarf tighter, tucked it beneath her coat. Another placed a dry pelt over her chest. The elder was beside her. She could feel his breath. Still there, still warm. She closed her eyes and let herself sink into the heat, into the dark, into the quiet roar of survival that echoed louder than any storm outside. Time passed in pieces. A crack in the cave ceiling dripped. The water receded, inch by inch. The wind screamed outside but never broke in again. She opened her eyes when the light began to change. Not daylight, but the soft pulse of coals dying. They were still there, all of them, around her, watching, waiting. She sat up slowly. Her limbs ached. Her clothes were half dry now, warmed by breath and stone and bodies that had refused to let her freeze. The elder's eyes fluttered once, just once, then closed again, but his breathing steady. She pressed her hand to his chest and let it rest there. For the first time since October began, the cave was still. Not silent, not cold, still. And somewhere, beneath it all, she felt the shape of something bigger than crisis, something sacred. She would remember that night for the rest of her life, not for the fear or the pain or the cold, but because on that night, a people who had every reason not to trust her had wrapped her in warmth, saved her life with bark and breath and arms too wide for this world. And she, in turn, had kept a dying elder from fading. It wasn't fair trade. It was family, and it had been born in floodwater and fire. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Because when she looked up, the younger one was already there, watching her. And in his eyes, she saw something that would follow her forever. Recognition. She had become one of them. The first frost came silent. Just a pale shimmer across the clearing, clinging to the pine needles and the tips of the brittle grass like dust from something ancient finally settling. It coated the edges of Iris's porch rail, froze the water in her tin pail solid before the sun crested the ridge. The air bit harder now. Each breath came with a sting, and in the stillness of that morning, as her fingers hovered over her thermos lid and her joints pulsed with dull ache, she knew the shift had come, not just in the season, in the story. She left the house slower that day, not from pain, from knowing. The trail down had changed since the flood. Mud hardened into veins of cracked clay. Branches snapped by wind still lay in twisted patterns. But the silence had softened. The woods weren't holding their breath anymore. Something had passed, and something else was rising in its place. She wore her heaviest coat, the gray wool one with the frayed cuffs that still held pine smoke in its threads. Her scarf was knotted tight beneath her chin, her boots double-laced. She carried only what she needed, a small pouch of dried root, a new flannel cloth she'd stitched by lamp the night before, and the cedar leaf from her daughter's box, now wrapped in gauze and slipped into her coat lining like a talisman. When she reached the cave mouth, the ivy that usually hung soft and alive had wilted, darkened. The cold had taken its color. Inside, the air met her skin like breath off stone. But it didn't push her back. It welcomed her. She stepped through the dark without lighting the lantern. There was light already inside. A strange, low glow, coming from a ring of coals in the far chamber, tended and fanned by one of the smaller ones, who looked up as she entered, then dipped its head and stepped aside. They were waiting, all of them, not in rows or formation, just present. Still, eyes catching the ember light, shoulders relaxed but reverent. The space felt different now, not tense, not sacred in the way it had been when she first entered. It was quiet, like a room just before a name is spoken, as though everything had gathered not just to witness, but to remember. She moved slowly, eyes scanning the chamber, and there he was, the elder, sitting, not slumped, not coughing, sitting, his massive shoulders draped in a thick wrap of moss and pelts, his chest rising and falling with measured ease. His eyes were half closed, but when he saw her, he blinked once. Then again, alive. She felt her breath catch, not in her throat, but behind her ribs. A pressure she hadn't known she'd been holding. She stepped closer, one hand instinctively reaching into her satchel. But then she stopped. She didn't need the medicine. The younger one stepped out of the shadows behind her. Taller now, or maybe it was just the way he carried himself. He walked beside her but didn't speak. He lowered himself slowly, one knee to the earth. Then, without a sound, he reached forward and placed his hand flat against the stone. Iris watched. Then he placed that same hand over his own heart. She swallowed. Then, slowly, he turned to the elder and placed his hand flat against the ground once more. There was no thunder, no chant, no movement from the others, just silence. But something happened in that moment. The elder's breath deepened. He leaned forward, not much, but enough. His massive hand, heavy with age and scar, reached down and mirrored the gesture. Stone. Chest. Then the hand rose. Toward her, Iris stood still, her hands at her sides, her mouth dry. He touched the earth before her feet, then gently placed that hand against her chest. The size of it made her breath catch, not from fear, from the weight of it all. She didn't move. She let it stay there. His hand lifted again, and with great care, he reached toward the satchel she carried. She opened it without thinking, reached in, pulled out the cloth bundle. Inside, the cedar leaf, the one she hadn't told anyone she was bringing. He took it from her, held it in his palm, studied it, not as something foreign, but as something understood. He looked at the young one, then back at her. Then he placed the leaf into a small fold of bark that sat beside his bedding, folded it, tied it with a strip of vine, and placed it beside a row of other things, a smooth stone, a dried berry, a fragment of woven hair. Things kept. Things passed down. She felt something shift deep in her chest, like someone had pulled a string that had been knotted for decades. She stepped back slowly, and then the younger one stood again. He walked to a corner of the chamber, where a bundle had been placed. Dried roots, leaves, bark. All the plants she had brought over the last month, dried and organized. And among them, her cloth pouch. He lifted it gently, walked back, and placed it into her hands. But it wasn't empty. Tucked inside was a small bundle of thistle roots, carefully cleaned and wrapped, and a narrow strip of hide tied in a loop. A gift, a gesture, something carried forward. She didn't cry. Not here, not now. But her throat tightened, and her vision blurred. She pressed the pouch against her chest, not for warmth, but to feel the weight of it. Behind her, the cave stayed still. No one spoke. No one moved, but the moment hung in the air like fog on a winter pond. Quiet, unshakable. She turned to leave, her steps slower now, her eyes catching on every shadow, every shape, every small, deliberate movement. And as she passed the entrance to the main chamber, the younger one followed. He reached past her, gently, and placed something into her satchel before she could ask. A single strand of root, mullein. The one she used first. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, he had stepped back. But not far. She stepped outside. The air hit her skin like breath from another world. The sky was clear now. No clouds, just stars. The frost glittered across the rocks. She walked back through the forest in silence. The night no longer pressed in. The trail felt lighter, and, though her hands were empty, her chest had never felt so full. By the time she reached the clearing by her cabin, the sky had begun to pale. A soft hush spread over the hills like a blanket being pulled over a sleeping child. She stopped just before the porch, looked back. Nothing moved in the woods, but she knew they were there, watching. Still, she didn't wave, didn't whisper goodbye. She just stepped inside, sat in her old chair, and pressed the bundle to her chest. And in the stillness that followed, she could feel the weight of what had just been tied. An invisible thread, running through root, stone, breath, and hand. It would never break. Not now, not ever. And though the cold pressed against her window pane, she smiled. Because somewhere, deep in the belly of the earth, a people who had never spoken her name now carried it. By late December, the sky had folded in on itself. Light came late and left early. The world around Laurel Fork had quieted to a kind of stillness that made even birdsong feel like an interruption. Snow didn't fall heavy, just enough to dust the bare branches and soften the edges of the cabin roof, to mark each step Iris took with a soundless imprint. Every morning she woke to a world covered in hush, not the kind that feared a sound, the kind that had already said what it needed to say. That morning, the air inside the house held a different weight. Not colder, not warmer, just thinner. The fire in the stove had long since burned out. She hadn't bothered to stoke it. She sat by the window in her gray shawl, the same one with the frayed edges and the cedar leaf still tucked in the corner seam. Her breath fogged against the glass as she looked out toward the tree line. It had been 3 days since she'd gone down the trail. 3 days since she'd felt that tug in her chest. 3 days since the dream. In it, the cave was empty. Not abandoned. Not destroyed. Just still, like a breath had been held, then released. She tried to shake it, but it lingered the way certain silences do. The ones you don't name, because once you do, they stay forever. She dressed slowly, layering her coat, her scarf, her mittens. She poured hot water into a small flask, tucked it inside her satchel, along with the bark-wrapped bundle of mullein root, now dry and cracked from weeks of use. She paused before she stepped out onto the porch, not from hesitation, from habit. But this time, there was no wind, no rustling, no eyes watching from the edge of the woods. She walked the path like she always had. Every turn memorized, every shadow expected. The air carried the scent of pine, faint and frozen. A few patches of deerscat dotted the trail, old and brittle. No fresh tracks. The cave was different before she even reached it. The ivy had turned black, brittle, dead. The stones around the mouth were undisturbed, but the sense was unmistakable. They were gone. She stepped inside. The coals were cold. The bedding had been stripped. The moss, the pelts, the bark vessels, all taken or disassembled. No leaves scattered. No footprints muddied the earth. The chamber was clean, not in the way humans cleaned, in the way nature reclaims what was once borrowed. She stepped further in, slowly. Her breath echoed off the walls, the only sound in the stone. She stood in the center of the space that had once held warmth, breath, ritual, and memory. And now, nothing. She didn't cry. Not yet. She crouched by the fire pit and touched the ash with the tip of her glove. Dry, cold, days old. Maybe more. She rose and turned toward the chamber wall where they had kept the small collection. The bark wrappings, the stones, the cedar leaf. Gone, all gone, except for one thing. At the far edge, near the split in the rock where the flood had once crept in, something had been pressed into the ground. Not placed. Pressed. She stepped toward it. Kneeling down, she brushed the snow-damp moss away and found it, a faint curve etched into the earth. Not carved, worn. A crescent shape, not a symbol, a gesture. The kind you'd leave behind when there are no words, but you still want to say goodbye. She stared at it a long time, let her fingers rest on the groove, let the cold reach her knuckles. Then she stood and walked away. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. By the time she reached the clearing, the sky had brightened slightly, the clouds pulling apart just enough to let a seam of blue break through. She stopped at the edge of the yard, turned toward her home, still standing, still hers, but different now. Inside, the kettle whistled softly on the stove. The fire had caught again from the coals she'd banked the night before. She peeled off her coat, her gloves, and sat down in the old chair with the blanket folded neatly across the armrest. The blanket her daughter had sewn. The one with the faded blue stitching and the corner tear she never mended. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the last thing they'd left behind. The only thing they'd given her that wasn't medicinal. A ring of bark twine, woven roughly but deliberate. She turned it in her fingers, then placed it gently on the windowsill. No explanation. No story, just presence. The sun broke for a moment through the trees, caught the edge of the ring, lit it up like a crown. She closed her eyes. She dreamed again that night. Not of the cave, not of the flood, not even of the elder's hand against her chest. She dreamed of a still forest, of something vast and gentle moving just beyond the trees. Not hiding, not watching, just walking. Gone back to wherever they came from, but not erased, just returned. She woke just before dawn, heart steady, hands warm, and for the first time in years, she did not feel alone. She sat on the porch as the sun pulled itself up over the ridge, the frost catching on every branch like lace. She held a cup of coffee between her palms, steam curling over her face. She looked out toward the tree line, not expecting anything, just remembering. Behind her, the wind caught the edge of the curtain and fluttered it gently. On the windowsill, the bark ring sat still, and on the floor beside her chair, her satchel lay open, the edges worn thin. Inside it, folded like it had never been moved, was the cloth she'd used that first night, the one she'd wrapped the apple in, folded perfectly, corners aligned. She picked it up slowly, pressed it to her chest, and finally let herself cry. Not from loss, from love. Because some stories don't end when someone leaves. They end when someone is seen. And she had been seen, completely. She stayed there long after the snow began again, tiny flakes catching in her hair, dissolving on the steam of her breath. When she finally stood, she didn't go back inside. She walked out into the yard, toward the edge of the trees. She knelt there near the old stump and pressed her palm to the cold earth. Then slowly, carefully, she laid the cloth down again, not as an offering, as an answer. And as she stood, the wind moved through the trees. Not loud, not wild, just present. She looked into the forest, into the stillness beyond the frost, and whispered, "You're not alone." Somewhere deep in the woods, where the wind carries no names and the trees have forgotten time, there are moments that don't need to be explained, only felt. We live most of our lives rushing toward noise, toward answers, toward proof. But sometimes the truest things aren't loud. They come in silence, in stillness, in the warmth of a hand held through the dark, or the quiet recognition in the eyes of someone who simply stays. This was never just a story about survival, or mystery, or the things we can't explain. It was always about connection, about how the softest gestures can echo louder than any word, about how healing often starts not with cures, but with presence, and how compassion, when given without expectation, has the power to reach across what we once thought were impossible divides. Some walls are not made of stone. They're made of grief, of fear, of being unseen for too long. But every time someone chooses kindness over caution, every time a stranger is met with gentleness instead of judgment, those walls crack. And through those cracks, light finds a way in. The world may never understand everything that dwells beyond the trees, or why some things come and go like dreams we're not meant to keep. But perhaps that's not the point. Perhaps the lesson isn't in the knowing, but in the feeling. In the way we carry the sacred things after they're gone. In the way we remember to show up, soft and human and whole, for someone else, even if no one else is watching. So if you're listening to this tonight with something heavy in your chest, or if you've ever felt like your voice was lost in the wind, just know this. Compassion leaves a mark, even in the quiet, even when no one says a word. Especially then. Thank you for being here, for walking through the silence with me. If this story touched something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe someone else needs to hear them. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing to the channel. There's more to come, more stories, more reminders that we're not as alone as we think. Until next time, take care of your heart. And when the forest is quiet, listen.